This institution serves elite clients, ma'am. The bank manager smirked as Claire Bennett stood frozen in her faded gray cardigan, clutching paperwork for her children's charity foundation while wealthy customers stared across the marble lobby. Maybe try somewhere more affordable. Then she pointed toward the door. The room went silent as a security guard stepped closer. Claire's eyes lowered in humiliation until the sound of polished dress shoes echoed across the floor. A man in a navy suit stopped beside her, his expression turning cold. One employee suddenly whispered, "Oh my God, that's Ethan Bennett." The billionaire slowly looked at the manager and said, "Why are you humiliating my wife?" They thought humiliating her would be easy, but before that morning was over, the entire bank would fall silent at the name Claire Bennett had tried so hard to keep hidden. The marble floors of Sterling National Bank reflected the pale winter sunlight pouring through 40-foot glass windows overlooking downtown Boston. Men in tailored navy suits crossed the lobby carrying leather briefcases, while women in designer heels spoke quietly beside polished chrome counters. Every movement inside the building carried an unspoken message about status, wealth, and power. And then Claire Bennett walked through the front doors wearing a faded gray cardigan, dark jeans, and white sneakers with slightly worn soles. For a brief moment, several heads turned. Not because she was loud, not because she demanded attention, but because she looked like someone who didn't belong there. Claire held a simple beige folder close to her chest as she stepped carefully across the shining marble floor. At 36, she carried herself with quiet grace, though years of avoiding attention had taught her how to make herself smaller in rooms filled with powerful people. Her soft blonde hair rested loosely against her shoulders, and the thin silver wedding band on her finger caught the morning light for only a second before disappearing beneath the sleeve of her cardigan. She paused near the customer service desk, taking a slow breath. The foundation paperwork inside the folder represented 6 months of planning. Her educational charity had finally secured enough donor funding to open 3 new literacy centers for underprivileged children across Massachusetts. All she needed to do today was finalize the bank partnership account. Simple. At least that was what she had told herself before walking in. Behind the polished reception counter stood Rebecca Collins, the bank's senior client manager. Rebecca's sharp white blazer and perfectly styled blonde hair matched the polished image Sterling National advertised to wealthy clients across New England. She noticed Claire immediately. More specifically, she noticed the cardigan, the sneakers, and the nervous way Claire adjusted the folder in her hands. Rebecca's professional smile appeared instantly, but it never reached her eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice carrying the kind of politeness that somehow felt colder than rudeness. Claire offered a small smile. "Yes, thank you. I'm here to open a nonprofit partnership account for the Bennett Learning Foundation. I spoke with someone earlier this week." Rebecca extended her hand for the folder, though her expression shifted the moment she glanced down at Claire's clothes again. Around them, the quiet hum of expensive conversations continued beneath the soft piano music playing through hidden speakers. "The Bennett Foundation?" Rebecca repeated slowly. "Yes." Claire nodded gently. "We're expanding our literacy program this spring." Rebecca opened the folder and scanned the paperwork. Her eyebrows lifted slightly when she noticed the funding amount attached to the foundation account. Nearly $2 million. For just a second, confusion crossed her face. Then suspicion replaced it. Her eyes traveled back toward Claire. "And this is your foundation?" she asked carefully. "I'm one of the directors," Claire answered. Rebecca gave a small nod, but internally, something no longer made sense to her. Women connected to multi-million-dollar foundations did not walk into Sterling National dressed like this. They arrived in luxury SUVs. They wore designer handbags and carried themselves with visible confidence. This woman looked like a substitute teacher stopping by after grocery shopping. Rebecca closed the folder slowly. "I see," she said, though her tone suggested the opposite. Nearby, a middle-aged couple waiting beside the investment offices glanced over curiously. Claire shifted slightly beneath the attention, but maintained her calm expression. "There shouldn't be any issues," Claire explained softly. Your partnership department already reviewed the documents. Rebecca tilted her head. Well, large financial partnerships require extensive verification, Ms. Bennett. Claire smiled politely. Of course. But Rebecca wasn't really listening anymore. She had already decided something about Claire the moment she walked through the door. And in places like Sterling National Bank, first impressions had a way of becoming dangerous. Rebecca rested the folder carefully on the polished counter, but the subtle shift in her posture made it clear that she no longer viewed Claire as a normal client. Suspicion had entered the room quietly, and once it arrived, it spread quickly. $2 million is a significant amount for a newly expanded nonprofit, Rebecca said, tapping one manicured nail against the paperwork. Especially for someone opening an account in person instead of through legal representation. Claire remained calm. The foundation has existed for 6 years. We simply need a dedicated account for our literacy centers. Rebecca nodded slowly, though her expression suggested she had already reached her own conclusions. Of course. The words sounded polite, but the air between them had changed. Nearby, 2 investment bankers waiting beside the private offices exchanged subtle glances toward Claire. One of them lowered his voice just enough to avoid being obvious, but not enough to avoid being heard. Probably inherited money, he muttered quietly. The other gave a faint smirk. Claire pretended not to notice. She had spent most of her adult life learning how to survive moments exactly like this. Long before her husband became one of the most recognizable financial figures in Boston, Claire had grown up in a small apartment outside Providence, raised by a single mother who worked double shifts at a nursing home. Expensive rooms still carried the same cold feeling they always had. Places where people measured worth before kindness. Rebecca reopened the paperwork and paused again at the foundation name. Bennett Learning Foundation. The same name connected to several major education grants across Massachusetts. The same foundation Sterling National had publicly praised during charity galas. Rebecca frowned slightly. Something about the situation bothered her. Wealthy donors did not arrive looking nervous and underdressed. They arrived expecting admiration. Claire only looked tired. Do you have additional identification? Rebecca asked. Claire handed over her driver's license without hesitation. Rebecca scanned it carefully before glancing back toward her cardigan and sneakers again. You understand, Rebecca said, lowering her voice slightly, that financial fraud has become increasingly common lately. Claire blinked once, surprised by the implication, but kept her tone respectful. I understand the need for verification. Rebecca studied her for another moment. Then she smiled again. That same polished smile that never touched her eyes. Please wait here. She picked up the folder and walked toward a glass office near the rear of the lobby. As Rebecca disappeared behind the office doors, Claire stood quietly beside the marble counter, suddenly aware of how exposed she felt beneath the lobby lights. Conversations around her continued softly, but she could feel occasional eyes drifting in her direction. A younger employee standing near the reception area glanced at Claire sympathetically before quickly looking away. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. Claire checked her phone once. A message from Ethan appeared on the screen. Running 5 minutes behind. Meeting ended late. Proud of you. She smiled faintly despite the growing discomfort in the room. Ethan always knew when she felt anxious before important events. It was one of the reasons she loved him. Not because of the money. Not because of the power. But because beneath all the headlines and billion-dollar acquisitions, he still noticed the smallest changes in her breathing. The office door finally opened. Rebecca stepped out beside a tall man in a charcoal suit wearing a Sterling National Executive badge. Both of them approached with careful expressions that instantly made Claire uneasy. Ms. Bennett, the executive began formally, I am David Mercer, Regional Compliance Director. Claire nodded politely. Nice to meet you. David offered a restrained smile. We simply have a few concerns regarding the legitimacy of these transfer documents. The words landed softly, but several nearby conversations immediately quieted. Claire felt heat rise slowly into her cheeks. The documents are legitimate, she answered carefully. Rebecca folded her arms lightly. You can understand how unusual this appears. Claire looked between them confused. What exactly appears unusual? David hesitated. But Rebecca answered first. A multi-million-dollar charitable account connected to someone who frankly does not fit the expected financial profile. The room did not become fully silent. But it became quiet enough for Claire to hear the distant echo of heels against marble floors somewhere near the front entrance of the bank. And for the first time that morning, something inside Rebecca Collins began to shift into very dangerous territory. Claire felt every pair of eyes slowly settling on her as the compliance director's words lingered in the air. The marble lobby suddenly felt colder than before. Somewhere behind her, the soft hiss of an espresso machine drifted from the private client lounge, mixing with the distant hum of expensive conversations that now sounded quieter, more cautious. Rebecca Collins stood beside David Mercer with her arms folded neatly, her posture calm and composed, but there was satisfaction hiding beneath the surface. She believed she had uncovered something suspicious. And people who believed they held authority rarely questioned themselves once that feeling arrived. Claire tightened her grip on the folder. I do not understand why my appearance has become part of this discussion, she said carefully. David shifted slightly, uncomfortable with how direct the situation was becoming. No one is making personal judgments, Miss Bennett. Rebecca glanced toward Claire's sneakers again before speaking. Sterling National handles extremely sensitive financial partnerships. We simply have standards regarding verification. Claire looked directly at her. You already said that. The answer was calm, but firm enough to surprise Rebecca for a moment. A nearby customer pretending to read financial paperwork lowered the paper slightly, openly listening now. Across the lobby, two younger employees exchanged uneasy looks. One of them quietly whispered, "This is getting bad." Claire took a slow breath. She could feel humiliation building beneath her calm exterior, pressing against her chest harder with every passing minute. Not because she doubted herself, but because moments like this awakened old memories she never fully escaped. Being underestimated, being quietly dismissed, being treated as though dignity had to be earned through appearance. Rebecca stepped closer to the counter. Perhaps if your legal representatives contact us directly, we can revisit this partnership another day. Claire blinked slowly. You are refusing to open the account? Rebecca offered another polished smile. I am saying there are concerns. David Mercer cleared his throat softly, sensing the growing tension. Maybe we simply need additional confirmation regarding the transfer authorization. Claire opened the folder and gently slid several signed documents across the marble surface. The authorization letters are already included. So are the tax certifications and donor approvals. David looked down at the paperwork. Everything appeared complete. Perfectly complete. Rebecca noticed his hesitation immediately. She leaned closer toward him and lowered her voice just enough to sound discreet while still allowing Claire to hear every word. David, we cannot ignore obvious red flags simply because someone printed professional documents. The sentence landed harder than she intended. Claire felt the blood drain slightly from her face. A heavy silence spread through the nearby lobby. Even the investment bankers watching from across the room looked uncomfortable now. For the first time since entering Sterling National, Claire considered leaving. Not because she was guilty. Not because she lacked confidence. But because public humiliation exhausted her in ways most people never understood. She had spent years helping children from poor neighborhoods believe they deserved opportunity and respect regardless of how they dressed or where they came from. Yet standing here now, surrounded by wealth and polished marble, she could feel that same invisible judgment pressing down on her again. Rebecca noticed the slight change in Claire's expression and mistook it for weakness. That was her mistake. Miss Bennett, Rebecca continued smoothly, large institutions like ours must protect themselves from reputational risk. Claire stared at her quietly. Reputational risk. Such elegant words for cruelty. Somewhere behind them, the elevator doors opened with a soft metallic chime. Several executives stepped out laughing quietly among themselves before suddenly stopping mid-conversation. One of the men adjusted his suit jacket immediately. Another straightened his posture as though someone important had just entered the building. Rebecca did not notice. She was too focused on Claire. I think it would be best if we pause this process for today, she said firmly. Security can escort you out if necessary. The sentence hit the room like ice water. One of the younger receptionists looked down instantly, unable to hide her discomfort. David Mercer turned sharply toward Rebecca. That may not be necessary, he muttered under his breath. But Rebecca had already crossed the line where pride becomes dangerous. Claire swallowed slowly. Her eyes lowered for only a second before she gathered herself again. I came here to help fund literacy centers for children, she said softly. I did not come here to be treated like a criminal. Rebecca's expression hardened. Then perhaps next time you should present yourself in a manner that inspires confidence. The room went completely silent. And then came the sound of slow footsteps crossing the marble floor behind them. The footsteps moved slowly across the marble floor, calm and deliberate, carrying a kind of quiet authority that caused conversations to fade one by one throughout the lobby. Claire recognized them instantly before she even turned around. Ethan. Her chest tightened with both relief and dread at the same time. She had never wanted him to see this side of the world again. Not because he would be angry for himself, but because Ethan Bennett had spent years trying to protect her from moments exactly like this. Rebecca Collins finally looked toward the entrance, irritation already forming on her face from the interruption. But the expression vanished almost immediately. A tall man in a tailored navy overcoat was crossing the lobby with measured steps, his silver watch catching the light beneath the crystal chandeliers overhead. The room changed the moment people recognized him. One executive standing near the elevator straightened so quickly he nearly dropped the folder in his hands. A private investment advisor whispered under his breath, "That is Ethan Bennett." The whisper spread quietly through the lobby like electricity. Claire saw Rebecca's posture stiffen. David Mercer's face lost color almost instantly. Ethan reached the counter and stopped beside Claire without saying a word at first. His eyes moved calmly from Claire's flushed expression to the paperwork scattered across the marble surface. Then his gaze shifted toward Rebecca. The silence that followed felt heavier than any shouting ever could have. "Claire," Ethan said softly, his voice steady and controlled, "what happened?" Claire tried to maintain composure, but hearing kindness after nearly an hour of humiliation almost broke her. "It is fine," she answered quietly. There was confusion regarding the foundation account. Ethan looked at the compliance director. Confusion? David Mercer opened his mouth, but Rebecca spoke first, eager to regain control of the situation. "Mr. Bennett, we were simply following verification procedures regarding suspicious financial documentation." The words had barely left her mouth before several employees nearby looked visibly uncomfortable. Ethan remained completely still. That was what made powerful people nervous around him. He never rushed. Never raised his voice. Never needed to. His calmness forced everyone else to hear themselves clearly. He glanced down at the folder and immediately recognized the Bennett Learning Foundation paperwork. A foundation he personally helped finance every year. A foundation that had quietly transformed thousands of children's lives without attaching his company name to any publicity campaign. Ethan slowly looked back at Rebecca. "You believed my wife was attempting financial fraud?" Rebecca's confidence faltered for the first time. "We only found the situation unusual." Ethan nodded once. "Unusual because of the paperwork?" Rebecca hesitated. No, Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. Then unusual because of how she looked. The room went silent again. Nobody moved. Nobody even pretended to continue their conversations anymore. Across the lobby, two clients openly stared now, waiting to see what would happen next. Rebecca forced another professional smile onto her face, though her voice sounded thinner now. "Sterling National serves a very particular clientele." Ethan glanced around the massive marble lobby. "I am aware," he replied quietly. "My investment group owns 12% of this bank." The sentence landed like thunder beneath the chandeliers. One of the younger receptionists covered her mouth in shock. David Mercer visibly swallowed. Rebecca froze completely. She had spent the last 40 minutes publicly humiliating the wife of one of the most influential investors connected to Sterling National. Claire lowered her eyes briefly, embarrassed by the attention now shifting violently in the opposite direction. Ethan noticed immediately. Even now, she looked more uncomfortable about the public scene than angry about the humiliation itself. That was who Claire was. Rebecca attempted to recover. "Mr. Bennett, if there has been any misunderstanding, I sincerely apologize." Ethan looked at her calmly. "Do you?" Rebecca blinked. Ethan stepped slightly closer to the counter, not aggressive, not threatening, simply present. "Because from where I was standing," he continued, "it sounded less like verification and more like humiliation." Nobody in the lobby dared speak. Even the soft piano music drifting through the speakers suddenly felt distant. Rebecca's polished confidence was beginning to collapse under the weight of the room's silence. Ethan finally turned toward Claire again, his expression softening immediately. "You should not have had to explain your worth to anyone here," he said quietly. And for the first time that morning, Rebecca Collins realized she had not merely offended a wealthy client. She had revealed something far worse about herself in front of the entire bank. Rebecca Collins felt the weight of every eye in the lobby pressing against her as the silence stretched painfully beneath the crystal chandeliers. Only minutes earlier, she had controlled the room completely. Now the atmosphere had shifted so dramatically that even breathing felt difficult. David Mercer adjusted his tie nervously beside her, suddenly aware that several executives across the bank were watching the situation unfold with growing alarm. Ethan Bennett remained calm. That was what unsettled people most about him. He did not posture. He did not threaten. He simply stood there with the quiet confidence of a man who never needed to prove his power because everyone else already understood it. Claire gently lowered her eyes toward the paperwork on the counter, clearly wishing the attention would disappear. Ethan noticed immediately. His expression softened for only a moment before he turned back toward Rebecca. "Tell me exactly what happened," he said quietly. Rebecca swallowed hard. There was concern regarding the legitimacy of the transfer documents. Ethan looked at David Mercer. "Did you review the documents personally?" David hesitated. "They appear legitimate." Rebecca turned toward him quickly, stunned by how fast his tone had changed. Ethan nodded once. Then the issue was never the documents. Nobody answered. The truth now hung openly in the air for everyone to see. A wealthy client standing near the investment offices slowly shook his head in disbelief. One of the younger receptionists looked visibly embarrassed to even wear the sterling national badge anymore. Claire finally spoke softly. "Ethan, it is all right. I would rather just finish the paperwork and leave." But Ethan did not move. He understood something Claire always tried to ignore. Humiliation like this did not disappear simply because the truth came out. The damage had already been done the moment someone decided she looked unworthy of respect. Rebecca attempted another smile, though it trembled slightly now. "Mrs. Bennett, I truly apologize if anything I said came across improperly." Claire looked at her quietly. "You suggested security escort me out." Rebecca's face lost color again. Across the marble lobby, someone whispered, "She actually threatened to remove her?" The whisper spread instantly. Ethan rested one hand lightly against the counter, his voice remaining level. "My wife came here to open an educational partnership account that would help fund literacy programs for children across the state." His eyes moved slowly across the employees nearby. And instead, she was treated like a public embarrassment because she wore sneakers. The room went completely still. Rebecca lowered her eyes for the first time since the confrontation began. The sentence sounded even uglier when spoken aloud. David Mercer cleared his throat carefully. "Mr. Bennett, on behalf of Sterling National, I would like to personally apologize for how this situation was handled." Ethan nodded slightly, though his expression remained unreadable. "Do you know why Claire dresses simply?" David stayed silent. Ethan answered the question himself. "Because she grew up watching her mother choose between groceries and electricity bills." Claire looked at him softly, almost pleading for him to stop drawing attention to her. But Ethan continued anyway. "Because she built her foundation to help children who know exactly what it feels like to walk into rooms where people immediately decide they matter less." Several employees now looked openly ashamed. Even some customers lowered their eyes. Rebecca stood frozen beside the counter, hearing every word like a mirror being held directly in front of her own behavior. Ethan finally turned toward Claire fully. "You spent 6 years helping children believe they deserve dignity," he said gently. "You should never have to beg for it yourself." Claire blinked quickly, fighting the emotion building behind her calm expression. The room remained silent except for the faint piano music drifting through the speakers overhead. Rebecca took a slow breath before speaking again, though her voice sounded smaller now. "Mrs. Bennett, I was wrong." Claire looked at her quietly. Rebecca's polished confidence was gone completely. All that remained was a woman finally hearing herself clearly for the first time. "I judged you before giving you the respect every person deserves," Rebecca admitted softly. "And I am deeply sorry." Ethan studied her for a long moment. Then he looked around the massive marble lobby where wealthy clients, executives, assistants, and receptionists all stood silently watching. "Money does not reveal character," he said calmly. "It reveals who you were before the money arrived." Nobody spoke after that, because deep down, everyone in the room understood exactly who had walked into Sterling National Bank wealthy that morning. And it was not the person wearing the expensive suit. The silence inside Sterling National Bank lingered long after Ethan Bennett finished speaking. Nobody rushed to fill it. Nobody dared. The words hung beneath the crystal chandeliers with a weight that felt heavier than the marble walls surrounding them. Rebecca Collins stood motionless behind the counter, her carefully polished image cracking more with every passing second. She had spent years mastering the appearance of professionalism, confidence, and control. But standing there now, under the quiet judgment of the entire lobby, she realized something painful. Professionalism without humanity was just arrogance, wearing expensive clothes. Claire gently reached for the folder on the counter, clearly hoping to end the scene before it grew even larger. She had never enjoyed attention, even when people were defending her. Especially then. "Ethan," she said softly, "we should go." But before Ethan could answer, another voice suddenly echoed across the lobby. "Mr. Bennett." The room shifted again as an older man in a dark charcoal suit stepped quickly from the private executive offices near the rear hallway. His silver tie hung slightly crooked, as though he had rushed down the moment someone informed him what was happening. Several employees immediately straightened their posture the second they saw him. It was Harold Whitmore, the president of Sterling National Bank. Rebecca's face strained completely. Harold approached Ethan with visible concern already written across his expression. "I just heard there was an issue involving the Bennett Foundation," he said carefully. Ethan looked at him calmly. "There was." Harold's eyes moved briefly toward Claire. The moment he recognized her, genuine shock crossed his face. "Mrs. Bennett," he said immediately, "I had no idea you were here today." Claire offered a polite nod despite everything that had happened. Harold turned slowly toward Rebecca and David Mercer. The silence alone was enough to make several nearby employees visibly nervous. "Would someone like to explain?" Harold asked carefully, "why one of the most respected educational foundations in this state was nearly escorted out of my bank?" Nobody answered immediately. Rebecca lowered her eyes. David Mercer looked as though he wanted to disappear entirely. Harold finally looked toward Claire again, and his expression softened with sincere embarrassment. "Mrs. Bennett, your foundation has funded reading programs in 12 cities. My own granddaughter attends one of your literacy centers in Cambridge." Claire blinked softly, surprised. Harold shook his head slowly. "You have helped thousands of children across the state believe they matter. The fact that you were treated this way inside my institution is unacceptable." Rebecca swallowed hard beside the counter. Every sentence made the humiliation worse now because for the first time, there was nowhere left to hide behind policy or procedure. Harold turned toward her directly. "Did you truly threaten to remove Mrs. Bennett from the building?" Rebecca's voice nearly disappeared. "Yes, sir." Harold closed his eyes briefly in disappointment. Across the lobby, employees who once admired Rebecca's confidence now avoided looking at her altogether. The room had completely changed sides. Ethan finally spoke again, though his voice remained calm. "Harold, Claire did not come here looking for revenge or special treatment." He looked toward his wife gently before continuing. She came here hoping to help children. Claire lowered her eyes again, emotional exhaustion finally beginning to show across her face. Ethan noticed immediately. He rested a reassuring hand lightly against her shoulder. Harold nodded slowly. And instead she was reminded how cruel appearances can make people. Nobody disagreed. Rebecca looked toward Claire, her composure fully gone now. "Mrs. Bennett," she said quietly, "I know apologizing cannot erase what happened today." Claire met her eyes for the first time since Ethan arrived. Rebecca continued carefully, her voice trembling slightly beneath the weight of genuine shame. "But you deserved kindness from the moment you walked through those doors. And I failed to give it." The lobby remained completely silent. Claire studied her for a long moment before finally speaking softly. "People who have struggled financially already spend their entire lives feeling invisible." Her voice remained gentle, but every word landed deeply across the room. "The least we can do is not make them feel small when they finally walk into places like this." Several employees lowered their heads. One receptionist quietly wiped tears from her eyes. Ethan looked at Claire with unmistakable pride. Because even after everything that happened, she still chose dignity over cruelty. Harold Whitmore slowly nodded. "Mrs. Bennett," he said quietly, "today this bank received a lesson far more valuable than any financial partnership." Claire held the folder close to her chest again as the marble lobby fell silent one last time. And in that silence, everyone inside Sterling National finally understood something wealth alone could never teach them. For several long seconds, nobody inside Sterling National Bank moved at all. The marble lobby that usually echoed with confident conversations and hurried financial negotiations had become completely still, as though the entire building itself understood that something far more important than money had just taken place. Claire Bennett stood quietly beside Ethan, holding the folder against her chest while dozens of strangers looked at her. Differently now. Not because of her clothes. Not because of the foundation paperwork. But because the truth had finally stripped away the assumptions people were so eager to make. Harold Whitmore slowly turned toward the employees gathered behind the reception counters. "Every single client who walks into this institution deserves dignity," he said firmly. "Not because of what they wear. Not because of what they own. But because they are human beings." His voice was not loud, but it carried through the silent lobby with unmistakable weight. Several younger employees nodded subtly, absorbing every word. Rebecca Collins remained frozen beside the counter, her eyes lowered. The confidence she once carried so naturally had disappeared entirely now, replaced by the painful awareness that the entire room had witnessed her failure in real time. Claire noticed the shame written across Rebecca's face and quietly exhaled. She knew that expression. Not arrogance anymore. Regret. Real regret. Ethan glanced down at his wife gently. "Are you all right?" Claire nodded softly, though her eyes looked tired. "I will be." Harold immediately stepped forward again. "Mrs. Bennett, if you are willing, I would personally like to oversee the partnership process myself." Claire hesitated briefly. Everyone in the lobby seemed to wait for her answer. A lesser person might have walked away. A cruel person might have enjoyed watching the room squirm beneath embarrassment. But Claire had spent too many years helping children recover from humiliation to become someone who enjoyed causing it herself. "The literacy centers still need funding," she said quietly. "So yes, I would like to continue." A subtle wave of relief moved through several employees nearby. Harold nodded gratefully. "Thank you." Ethan watched Claire carefully, and despite everything that had happened, pride softened his expression again. This was exactly who she had always been. The kind of person who chose purpose over ego. Harold gestured respectfully toward the executive offices. "Please, allow me to bring you somewhere more comfortable." As Ethan and Claire prepared to follow him, Rebecca suddenly spoke again. "Mrs. Bennett." Claire paused and turned back. Rebecca looked visibly emotional now, standing beneath the bright lobby lights, without any of the polished composure she had relied on all morning. "May I ask you something?" Claire nodded gently. Rebecca swallowed hard before speaking. "Why did you not tell us who you were the moment you walked in?" The question hung quietly in the air. Several employees looked up curiously, waiting for the answer themselves. Claire thought for a moment before responding. Because people who cannot offer basic respect without knowing someone's status usually do not deserve the introduction. The room fell silent once more. Rebecca lowered her eyes again, the truth of the statement landing harder than any insult could have. Ethan gently placed his hand against Claire's back as they began walking toward the executive offices with Harold Whitmore. The sound of their footsteps echoed softly across the marble floor while employees and customers instinctively stepped aside to let them pass. But halfway across the lobby, Claire suddenly stopped. Ethan looked at her with quiet concern. Claire turned back toward the younger receptionist who had remained silent through most of the confrontation. The young woman looked startled when Claire approached her. "You looked uncomfortable earlier," Claire said softly. The receptionist nodded nervously. "I was." Claire offered her a small smile. "That means your instincts are still good. Do not lose that in places like this." Tears immediately filled the young woman's eyes. "Thank you, Mrs. Bennett." Claire simply nodded before turning away again. Harold Whitmore watched the exchange carefully, and something in his expression changed. Because for the first time that morning, everyone inside Sterling National finally understood why the Bennett Foundation had transformed so many lives. It was never just about money. It was about the rare kind of kindness that remains gentle even after being humiliated. And as Claire disappeared down the hallway beside Ethan, the massive marble lobby behind them remained unusually quiet. Not out of fear this time, but out of reflection. The executive conference room on the 32nd floor overlooked the entire Boston skyline, but even the sweeping view of steel towers and winter sunlight reflecting off the harbor could not fully erase the heaviness Claire still carried inside her chest. Harold Whitmore personally held the glass door open as Ethan and Claire entered the room, a gesture that would have stunned most employees downstairs. Sterling National's president rarely escorted anyone himself. Yet now he moved with the careful respect of a man fully aware that dignity, once damaged, could not simply be repaired with apologies alone. Claire quietly took a seat near the far end of the polished walnut table while Ethan settled beside her. The room smelled faintly of fresh coffee and leather-bound portfolios. Floor-to-ceiling windows flooded the space with pale afternoon light, casting long reflections across the glossy surface of the conference table. Harold removed his suit jacket slowly, looking older now than he had downstairs. "Mrs. Bennett," he began carefully, "before we continue with the partnership documents, there is something I feel obligated to say." Claire looked toward him calmly. Harold folded his hands together. "I built my career believing that institutions like this represented professionalism and trust." He glanced briefly toward the skyline outside. "But today I was reminded that systems only reflect the character of the people inside them." Ethan remained silent, allowing Harold to speak freely. Claire listened quietly, though the exhaustion beneath her calm expression had not fully disappeared. Harold continued softly. "What happened downstairs should never have happened to anyone." Claire lowered her eyes for a moment before answering. "The difficult part is that it happens more often than people realize." Harold looked at her carefully. "You have experienced this before." Claire gave a faint nod. "Many times." The room fell quiet again. Ethan reached for her hand beneath the table, his thumb brushing gently against her fingers. Claire smiled faintly at the gesture before continuing. "People think humiliation only hurts when someone shouts or insults you directly. But sometimes it is quieter than that." Her voice remained soft, but every word carried weight. "Sometimes it is the look someone gives you before you even speak. The assumption that you are less intelligent, less trustworthy, less worthy of respect." Harold listened without interruption. Claire looked toward the windows. "When my mother worked night shifts at the nursing home, she used to bring me to the grocery store at 11 o'clock at night because that was when discounted food was marked down." Ethan watched her carefully. Even after years together, hearing her talk about childhood still affected him deeply. "I remember cashier sighing when she counted coupons," Claire said quietly. "I remember pretending not to notice people staring at our cart." Her eyes lowered briefly. "That feeling stays with people longer than most realize." The conference room remained completely silent except for the distant hum of the city below. Harold slowly sat back in his chair, visibly moved. Ethan finally spoke, his voice calm and steady. "That is why Claire created the foundation." Harold looked toward him. Ethan smiled faintly at his wife. Not because she wanted recognition. Because she remembers what invisibility feels like. Claire looked embarrassed by the attention again, but Harold's expression softened even more. "The literacy centers are not just educational programs, are they?" Claire shook her head gently. "No," she paused briefly before continuing. "Most of the children we help come from families who already feel overlooked by the world. I wanted them to walk into places that made them feel seen instead." Harold lowered his eyes for a second, absorbing the words carefully. For the first time in years, the president of Sterling National Bank looked less like a corporate executive and more like a man confronting uncomfortable truths about the world he helped build. A quiet knock interrupted the room. One of Harold's assistants stepped inside carrying fresh partnership documents along with coffee and tea on a silver tray. The assistant placed everything carefully on the table before hesitating awkwardly. "Mrs. Bennett," she said softly, "my younger brother attends one of your reading programs in South Boston." Claire looked up surprised. The assistant smiled nervously. "He used to hate school. Now he reads every night." Claire's tired expression softened instantly. "That makes me very happy to hear." The assistant nodded gratefully before leaving the room. Harold watched the exchange in silence. Then he slowly exhaled. "You know," he said quietly, "there are people with billions of dollars who never leave behind anything half as valuable as what you have built." Claire looked down modestly. Ethan smiled gently beside her. And somewhere deep inside Sterling National Bank, the quiet woman who had walked through the front doors wearing worn sneakers had already changed far more lives that day than anyone inside the building fully realized.